flash exposure, aperture, ISO, strobe output, and strobe distance. We've discussed that shutter speed doesn't affect flash exposure, so what does? There are 4 main elements that you can use to control your exposure in the studio: aperture, ISO, strobe distance, and strobe output. Let's take a look at each one of these elements. Now, knowing how they affect exposure, as well as the rest of your photo, is going to allow you to problem solve when you're looking to adjust your exposure in the studio. Aperture. Your aperture controls how much light you're letting into your sensor during an exposure. With a wide aperture, which is a lower number, your strobe is going to appear brighter because the wide aperture is allowing more light through. With a narrow aperture, the higher number, the exposure is going to appear darker because less light was able to get through to the exposure. Now, of course, aperture is also going to affect your depth of field. And in the studio, let's say you're shooting against a solid background, the effect of depth of field is less noticeable. Your aperture choice becomes much more important when you're shooting groups, if you need everything in focus, or maybe when you have a textured background and you want to soften the appearance of that texture. In short, if you want the strobe to appear brighter, open up your aperture. If you want the exposure to appear dimmer or darker, close down your aperture. It's as simple as that. Let's jump over to the studio and take a look. I've metered this scene, which we're going to talk about later, and I need to be shooting at an aperture of f8 to get the correct exposure. So let me start with that aperture as my base point, and then we'll see how aperture changes the exposure in this scene. So right now I'm at 1/200th of a second, f8, ISO 100. Okay, I have a correctly exposed image. But I know that one way I control the exposure in the studio is by changing my aperture. So if I go from f8 and I open up a stop to f5.6, the image is going to get brighter. Because I've opened the aperture wider, it allows more light to enter the sensor. So let's open up to 5.6 and take a photograph. It is now twice as bright. It is a full stop lighter. But now I could also go the other direction. So from 8.0 to f11. When I go to f11, I'm actually closing down my aperture. I'm making the hole smaller, letting less light through, which will make the image darker. And you can see the image is darker. This is one of the controls I use all the time when I need to tweak the light just a little bit. My camera is set so that I can adjust my aperture in thirds of a stop. So if I need to lighten something up just a little bit or darken it down, I don't have to make a lot of changes. I don't need to move my light or change the power. All I do is open up or close down my aperture. Personally, I find myself shooting around an aperture of f8 to f11 most of the time, unless I'm purposely trying to blur out the background. And you might think that this is a little high, but in my mind, it kind of saves me from accidentally missing my focus. That being said, honestly, there's not a right or wrong aperture. It just depends on the depth of field you're going for. And it's a really great tool, changing your aperture, to make really quick and small adjustments to your exposure.